On a humid night in late summer, 1969, a handful of lanterns appeared one by one in a hollow above Cold Creek, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. By the time dawn reached the ridgeline, nothing seemed out of place. No sirens, no bodies, no reports filed. And yet, something irreversible had already begun. Over the following year, 6 adult men would leave that hollow alive but altered, their silence louder than any accusation. Doctors would treat injuries they could not explain. Sheriffs would open files they could not finish. Neighbors would stop asking questions altogether. The people responsible were not criminals, not organized militants, not fugitives hiding from the law. They were 3 sisters, local, ordinary, women who had lived their entire lives above the creek and never once appeared in a headline, until whispers turned into warnings. Authorities would later struggle to define what happened there. Some called it religious extremism. Others called it collective hysteria. Those who lived nearby used a different word, one spoken only in private. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It wasn't even about belief. It began with a single stolen kiss, and a line crossed in a place where lines were never meant to move. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the summer of 1969, when the moon hung low over the ridges and the radios crackled with news from faraway cities, there were hollows in Appalachia where time did not move forward. It settled, it pressed down, it remembered. Coal dust still clung to porches long after the seams were exhausted, and Sunday bells carried farther than the law ever did. Outsiders called these places poor. The people who lived there called them quiet. Quiet enough to hear a secret breathe. Harlan County sat folded into the mountains like a kept letter. The road into it bent twice, then disappeared into trees so old their roots surfaced like knuckles. In 1969, the mines were closing one by one, and men who had learned to measure life by shifts learned instead to measure it by what they could hold on to. Churches filled on Sundays, bars filled on Saturdays, and in between there were gatherings no one put on a calendar. The Moore sisters were known before they were named. Folks spoke of them as a unit, the way you speak of weather or dogs that hunt together. Ada, Ruth, and Lila Moore lived above Cold Creek, in a house built by their grandfather, a man who believed roofs should last longer than promises. Their father had died underground in '58. Their mother followed not long after, illness carried by grief. The sisters stayed. They learned to keep bees, to can, to cut wood, to read a room without speaking. They were not recluses. They were present in the way mountains are present, unchallenged, uninvited, unavoidable. In that year, everything felt close to breaking. Young men left for cities or came back changed. The war on the radio sounded like it was happening to someone else, but the funeral said otherwise. Authority was thin. Sheriffs knew families before laws. Preachers warned of decay and called it salvation. And in the woods above Cold Creek, there were nights when lanterns moved between trees like stars fallen to earth. It was called a prayer circle by those who attended, a healing meeting by those who defended it, a cult by those who would later need a word that explained blood without explaining belief. The gatherings began with hymns and ended with confessions. They took place on new moons. No alcohol, no children, men and women separated by firelight, and rules older than any book on the shelf. The Moore sisters did not lead the circle. They kept it. Ada kept the ledger, names, dates, offerings of food or labor. Ruth kept the songs, her voice steady enough to pull people into rhythm. Lila kept the door, which was to say she watched who came and who left, and when. The preacher who spoke there came and went, and then he didn't come back. The circle continued anyway. The first incident was not recorded as violence. It was recorded as an insult. On a humid evening in August, a man named Caleb Turner arrived late. He was known in town for hands that wandered and a laugh that tested boundaries. He had worked 3 mines and been let go from all of them. He took a seat too close to the women's fire and spoke too loudly during the hymn. When the circle ended, as people stood to leave, he leaned toward Ruth and pressed his mouth against hers without invitation, without apology. It lasted only a second. It landed like a hammer. No one shouted. No one chased him. The woods swallowed sound the way they always had. What happened after would not be spoken of plainly. It would be described as judgment, as punishment, as a lesson, as a warning. In police notes written later, it would be summarized as severe bodily harm inflicted with ritual implements. In town, it would be called the night Caleb Turner stopped smiling. By morning, he was found near the creek, alive, bleeding, unable to explain himself beyond a shaking insistence that he had been corrected. The hospital in Harlan County treated what it could and transferred what it couldn't. The sheriff asked questions and wrote nothing down that would make him knock on the wrong door. Rumors traveled faster than ambulances. By the end of the week, men who had laughed too freely learned to keep their distance. By the end of the month, the prayer circle had doubled. Fear has a way of organizing people. The Moore sisters did not attend town meetings. They did not answer questions. They continued to sell honey at the market and jars of beans in season. Ada's ledger grew thicker. Ruth's hymns changed key. Lila's watch grew sharper. Between August and December, 5 more men were hurt. Always alone. Always after the gatherings. Always with the same mark of having crossed a line that no one in authority could clearly define. None died. All lived with consequences they would not describe. Doctors used clinical language. Preachers used warnings. The mountains kept the rest. By winter, the phrase, "the kiss," meant something else entirely. In December, state troopers drove through Harlan County twice and left without stopping. In January, a reporter from Lexington called the sheriff and was told there was nothing to report. In February, the prayer circle moved higher up the ridge, farther from roads, closer to the old chestnut grove where trees had survived blight by standing apart. This was the year when people learned that belief could be organized and that silence could be enforced without guns. It was the year the Moore sisters became more than sisters in the minds of those who watched from a distance. They became a boundary. No one knew where it would end. Everyone knew why it had begun. And in the hollows, where kisses were no longer simple things, the mountains listened and said nothing. By early 1970, the prayer circle no longer felt like a gathering. It felt like a system. Winter pressed hard into the Appalachians that year. Snow sealed roads for days at a time, and Cold Creek froze into a narrow ribbon of glass. Isolation did what it always did in the mountains. It sharpened loyalty and erased alternatives. People did not ask whether the circle was right or wrong. They asked whether it worked, and for many, it did. The rules were never written down, but everyone knew them. No touching without consent, no speaking during hymns, no alcohol before or after the fire. Confession was voluntary, but silence was binding. What happened within the ring of lanterns stayed there. Breaking that rule meant exclusion, and exclusion, in Harlan County, was a slow death. The Moore sisters enforced none of this openly. They never raised their voices. They never threatened. The enforcement came from structure. Ada's ledger tracked attendance and offerings with the precision of an accountant. If a name stopped appearing, people noticed. Ruth's hymns grew longer, slower, forcing participants to breathe together, to settle into something that felt ancient and unmovable. Lila watched, always watched, not with suspicion, but with memory. She remembered who stood too close, who drank too much, who laughed at the wrong time. Men began to arrive cautious. Hands stayed visible, voices lowered. A few stopped coming altogether. Those were the ones who told stories later in bars, half drunk, half afraid, insisting the sisters were witches or lunatics. No one listened for long. Those men had always talked too much. The second incident happened in October, and this time there were witnesses. A man named Earl Whitman, a seasonal logger from over the ridge, arrived at the circle uninvited. He had heard about the gatherings from a cousin and came curious, not reverent. During the separation at the fire, he crossed the boundary between the men's side and the women's side, claiming he had lost his gloves. Lila stepped in front of him. He laughed and reached around her. What followed was fast, silent, coordinated. Earl was not beaten in the open. He was led away. Those who remained heard nothing but hymns restarting, Ruth's voice steady enough to anchor the night. When Earl returned hours later, supported by 2 men who would not meet anyone's eyes, the lesson was already complete. This time, the hospital report triggered a call beyond the county. A state investigator arrived in November. He asked about gatherings, about land ownership, about the sisters. He was given pie and short answers. He walked the ridges and saw nothing illegal. He spoke to Caleb Turner, who refused to testify. He spoke to Earl Whitman, who left town the next day. The file remained open, thin, unprovable. What the investigator never understood was that the punishment was not the point. The certainty was. The circle created a predictable outcome in a world where minds collapsed without warning, and sons came back from war unable to sleep. Rules, once proven, became comfort. By December, the circle had begun drawing people from neighboring counties. Women came quietly, alone or in pairs, saying they felt safer there than anywhere else. Men came with conditions, hands clasped behind backs, eyes down, voices controlled. The sisters never advertised. Word traveled the way warnings always do in small places. The sermons changed tone. The preacher who returned briefly that winter spoke less of salvation and more of order. He quoted scripture selectively, favoring passages about discipline and consequence. He did not stay long. The circle did not need him. Belief had already been replaced by expectation. Behind closed doors, the sisters argued for the first time. Ada worried about scale. Ledgers were meant to track, not to invite attention. Ruth worried about purity. Songs lost power when sung by those who did not understand their weight. Lila worried about escalation. Each incident pushed the boundary of what could be undone. They agreed on one thing: the line could not move, not back, not forward. Then came the third man. His name was Thomas Reed. He was married, respected, a deacon at a local church. He attended the circle 3 times without incident. On the 4th, he stayed late, offering to help extinguish the fire. When Ruth bent to gather lanterns, he whispered something no one else heard. She straightened. She did not respond. Lila saw the change before anyone else did. Thomas Reed was found the next morning near the chestnut grove, alive, conscious, and permanently altered. This time, there was no rumor. There was certainty. Men stopped testing boundaries altogether. Husbands forbade daughters from walking alone near Cold Creek, not out of fear of the sisters, but out of fear of what might happen if rules were broken and consequences followed. Mothers spoke of the circle in low voices, as if it were a weather pattern that had settled in for the season. Law enforcement stopped asking questions. The circle became self-policing. Men corrected men. Women watched women. Outsiders felt the pressure immediately, like altitude sickness. Some left. Some stayed and adapted. By spring, 6 men had been punished. None had died. All had lived long enough to change the behavior of dozens more. The Moore sisters never celebrated. There were no speeches, no declarations. Ada closed her ledger each night with the same care she always had. Ruth ended hymns the same way she began them, voice unbroken. Lila stood at the edge of the light, measuring who belonged and who did not. What no one outside the hollow understood was this: the kiss had stopped being about desire. It had become about control, about whether the mountains would remain a place where boundaries meant something. And as the thaw came and roads reopened, the circle prepared for a summer that would test whether fear alone was enough to hold a system together. It rarely is. Spring of 1970 brought mud, movement, and questions. As the thaw loosened the roads, it also loosened tongues. Men who had kept quiet through winter began traveling again. Truck stops filled, county lines blurred, and with movement came stories, unfinished, distorted, dangerous stories that no longer belonged only to the hollow. By April, people outside Harlan County had a name for what was happening above Cold Creek. They called it a cult. The word arrived before the proof ever did. It came through a regional paper in Pikeville, buried under a headline about mine closures and overdoses. Unusual religious gatherings reported in eastern Kentucky. No names, no accusations, just enough detail to make law enforcement nervous and locals angry. Inside the hollow, the Moore sisters read the article in silence. Ada folded the paper and placed it beneath the ledger. Ruth did not sing that night. Lila walked the perimeter twice before allowing anyone near the fire. Attention was the one thing the circle had never prepared for. The next gathering was the largest yet. Not because more people were invited, but because fewer dared to stay away. When belief systems are challenged, attendance becomes a form of allegiance. Faces appeared from counties the sisters had never seen. Some came respectful. Some came curious. A few came looking for something to take home and sell as truth. The rules were announced clearly for the first time, not by the sisters, but by the group. A man stood and recited them, as if reading scripture. No touching, no crossing the fire, no speaking without permission, no leaving before the last hymn. No one objected. Enforcement had become communal. That was new and dangerous. Ruth noticed it first. The hymns no longer settled people. They sharpened them. Voices were louder, the rhythm tighter. The music had stopped soothing and started binding. When people sang now, they sang to prove something, to the circle, to themselves, to whoever might be listening from the dark. Ada noticed the offerings change. Less food, more cash. Knives left intentionally near the fire, then quietly retrieved. Symbols of commitment, disguised as practicality. Lila noticed the eyes. Too many of them watched, not for rules, but for opportunity. In May, the 4th man was punished. His name was Daniel Price. He was not local. He had driven in from West Virginia with 2 friends after hearing rumors in a bar. They stayed only long enough to realize they were not welcome. On the way out, Daniel grabbed a young woman by the wrist and pulled her close, laughing as if daring someone to stop him. Someone did. This time, the response was not quiet. Daniel was taken openly. The hymns continued louder. drowning out whatever words he might have said. When he was returned before dawn, the message was unmistakable. This was no longer correction. It was demonstration. By morning, his friends were gone. By nightfall, the sheriff had received 3 calls from outside the county. State police returned. This time, they did not come alone. They walked the land. They photographed paths. They asked questions no one answered. Ada's ledger was hidden beneath floorboards. The sisters were interviewed separately. Their stories matched without rehearsal. That unsettled the officers more than any contradiction would have. Still, there was nothing they could prove. No bodies, no weapons, no witnesses willing to speak. The case stalled again, but not before something irreversible happened. The presence of law enforcement split the circle. Some wanted to go higher into the mountains, farther from roads, farther from scrutiny. Others wanted to stop entirely, to dissolve before the word cult became an accusation instead of a rumor. A smaller group, quiet, intense, wanted to push forward, to make the consequences so absolute that no one would ever test them again. The sisters argued late into the night. Ada warned that systems collapse when they grow faster than their rules. Ruth feared the hymns had become a drumbeat, not a prayer. Lila said little, but when she did, her words landed hard. "They are watching us now," she said, "and some of them want to be us." That was the truth no one wanted to face. The circle had stopped protecting boundaries. It had started attracting those who enjoyed enforcing them. In June, a young man named Harold Knox disappeared for 2 days. He was known for drinking, known for temper, known for boasting that no woman would ever scare him. He attended the circle once, laughed through a hymn, and left early. 2 nights later, he was gone. When he reappeared, he was not harmed in the way the others had been. He was untouched, and he was broken. He refused to speak. He refused to drink. He would not cross Cold Creek again. He sold his truck and left the county before summer ended. That scared people more than blood ever had. Because whatever happened to Harold Knox had not been punishment. It had been something else, something quieter, something that didn't leave marks doctors could chart. Rumors turned darker. People spoke of isolation, of rituals meant to strip men of identity, not just arrogance. The word castration began to be whispered, sometimes incorrectly, sometimes not. Truth and exaggeration braided together until no one could separate them. By July, 6 men had been punished or broken in connection to the circle. 6. The number carried weight, biblical weight, superstitious weight, enough to feel intentional even if it wasn't. The Moore sisters felt it too. Ada closed the ledger earlier each night. Ruth shortened the hymns. Lila watched not just the edges, but the center. Power had shifted. The circle no longer belonged to those it was meant to protect. And when power shifts in a place built on silence, it does not drift, it snaps. By the end of summer, someone inside the circle would make a mistake. Someone would go too far. And the mountains, patient as they always were, would finally give the outside world something it could no longer ignore. The mistake happened on a night when the air would not move. August of 1970 arrived heavy and wet, the kind of heat that made people irritable and reckless. Crickets went quiet for long stretches, then returned all at once, as if correcting themselves. Even before the lanterns were lit, the Moore sisters sensed it. The circle felt wrong. Too many people, too many who did not belong to the land, only to the idea of it. Attendance had stopped being personal. It was now strategic. Men stood in places they had not earned. Women whispered to one another instead of watching the fire. The hymns started late. Ruth felt her voice strain to pull everyone into the same rhythm. It did not hold. The song fractured, syllables drifting apart like boards pulled from a bridge. Ada noticed 3 names missing from the ledger. Women who had attended faithfully for months. They had not sent word. They had not brought offerings. Absence, in a system built on presence, was never accidental. Lila noticed the newcomer. He arrived without escort, walking out of the trees as if he knew the path. Mid-30s, broad shoulders, military posture that did not relax even at rest. His name, when asked, was James Keller. He said he was passing through, said he had heard this was a place where people respected rules. He smiled when he said it. Lila did not like smiles at the fire. The gathering followed protocol, but the energy stayed tight, coiled. When the men and women separated, Keller positioned himself close enough to hear both sides. No one corrected him. That was the first failure. Structure only works when it is enforced early. After the hymns, during the quiet that followed confession, Keller spoke. He spoke about order, about how chaos grows when boundaries are weak, about how fear, properly applied, could save a community. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He framed himself as an ally. Some nodded. Ruth felt something drop inside her chest. This was not a man seeking protection. This was a man seeking permission. When the gathering ended, Keller stayed behind. helping extinguish lanterns, carrying ash away from the fire. He moved as if he belonged there, as if the circle had been waiting for him. The incident that followed was not planned by the sisters. That mattered later. A young woman named Eleanor Pike, barely 19, was walking back toward the creek when Keller stepped into her path. What he said was not heard by many, but the way she stiffened was. He reached out. She pulled away. He laughed and reached again. This time, the response came from the circle itself, not the sisters, not Lila. 3 men moved first, not to stop Keller, but to restrain Eleanor, to keep order, as one of them said later. In the confusion, Keller struck her, not hard enough. The woods went silent. What happened next happened fast, but not cleanly. Keller was taken, but not to the place the sisters used. He was dragged farther up the ridge, toward the abandoned mining road, where no one had ever been punished before. Voices rose. Orders were given by people who had never given them. By the time Lila arrived, breathless and furious, the situation had slipped beyond retrieval. This was not correction. This was possession. Keller fought. He laughed. He dared them to do worse, and someone did. The injury was severe, irreversible, inflicted not with ritual precision, but with rage and imitation, the kind of violence that does not enforce rules. It proves nothing except that the line has been crossed. By dawn, Keller was dead. Not immediately, not cleanly, but dead all the same. His body was left near the old road, arranged poorly, panic evident in every decision made after the fact. Blood on leaves, footprints everywhere, evidence the mountains could not swallow quickly enough. When the sisters learned what had happened, they did not speak. Ada sat at the table and stared at the ledger, pages that suddenly meant nothing. Ruth vomited behind the house and did not sing for days. Lila walked to the ridge alone and stood where the ground had been disturbed, memorizing every mistake. By noon, someone had already called it in. The response was immediate. State police arrived with numbers, not questions. They sealed roads. They brought dogs. They brought photographers who knew exactly what to document. The sheriff did not argue. He stepped aside and watched something he had helped avoid for a year finally take shape. James Keller's background came quickly. He was not passing through. He had been discharged dishonorably 2 years earlier. Assault, excessive force. He had drifted since then, attaching himself to groups that confused discipline with domination. He had left trouble behind him in 3 counties already. Each time, the story ended before it could be written down. This time, it did not. The media arrived within 48 hours. They used words like sect, mutilation, ritual killing. They asked about castration. They asked about the sisters by name. They printed photos of the house above Cold Creek, bees buzzing quietly in the background like a cruel detail. The Moore sisters were taken in separately. Ada said nothing beyond confirming her name and age. Ruth answered questions about hymns and scripture, her voice steady but empty. Lila spoke last. She did not deny the existence of the circle. She did not defend it. She said only this: "We kept rules so women could breathe." It was the only sentence any of them would offer that year. Inside the hollow, reactions split along familiar lines. Some wept. Some burned papers and hid objects they should have hidden months earlier. Some felt relief that the tension had finally broken. Others felt fear, not of the law, but of what would replace the circle now that it was gone. The mountain, silent for so long, had answered, and it had answered in a way no one could control. By September, arrests would follow. By October, charges would be filed. By winter, the circle would be gone in practice, if not in memory. But the question hanging over Harlan County was no longer whether the Moore sisters were guilty. It was whether anything they had built had ever truly been theirs to stop. And as investigators combed the ridges and counted mistakes, one truth became unavoidable. The violence that ended the cult did not come from belief. It came from imitation, and that, more than anything, would decide what happened next. By October of 1970, the mountains were quiet again, but it was not the old quiet. It was the kind that follows a gunshot echoing through trees, when everyone knows the sound is gone but waits anyway, listening for what comes next. Roads reopened. Troopers left in pairs instead of convoys. Reporters drifted back to cities where stories moved faster and bled cleaner. What remained in Harlan County was not relief. It was scrutiny turned inward. The law had taken James Keller's body. It had taken notebooks, lanterns, hymn sheets, knives whose ownership no one claimed. But it did not take the question everyone felt pressing against their ribs: who was actually responsible? The state charged 3 men from the circle with second-degree murder. Not the sisters, not yet. The decision baffled outsiders and enraged locals who wanted a simpler villain. Prosecutors understood something the headlines did not. There was no single hand to blame and no clear hierarchy to sever. The cult, if it could be called that, had not operated like one. It had operated like a climate. The Moore sisters were released after 48 hours. No charges, no apology. Their house was searched again anyway. Ada returned first. She cleaned the kitchen slowly, deliberately, as if routine might reassert jurisdiction over what had happened. Ruth returned next and avoided the piano entirely. Lila returned last, after speaking with investigators one more time, insisting on a walk up the ridge before entering the house. She needed to see the land still holding its shape. Word spread fast. Some believed the sisters had escaped justice. Others believed justice had no language for what they'd done. Women came quietly to the Moore house with food, with thanks, with tears they hadn't shed in years. Men came less often. When they did, they stood at a distance, hats in hand, unsure which version of themselves the sisters remembered. The trial began in November. It was not held in Harlan County. The state moved it 2 counties over, citing security concerns. What they meant was contamination. Too many jurors knew too many stories. Too many deputies had chosen silence over reports. The mountains once again were being treated like a liability. Inside the courtroom, everything flattened. The prayer circle became unauthorized religious activity. The rules became coercive practices. The injuries became grievous bodily harm. Context bled out under fluorescent lights. No one sang. No one prayed. The men on trial sat stiff, confused by how quickly conviction replaced certainty. Witnesses spoke carefully. Caleb Turner testified with his eyes on the floor. Earl Whitman said nothing of what happened, only that he learned his lesson. Doctors used words like trauma and irreversibility. Prosecutors avoided the word castration until forced to use it, then said it once and never again. The sisters were subpoenaed. Ada testified first. She spoke plainly. She described the ledger as attendance, not control, offerings as mutual aid, not payment. When asked whether she condoned punishment, she said, "I condoned boundaries." Ruth followed. She spoke about music, about breathing together, about fear settling when people felt heard. When asked if she knew men were being harmed, she said yes. When asked if she approved, she said, "Approval was never the question." Lila testified last. She stood without notes. She did not raise her voice. When the prosecutor asked who enforced the rules, she paused. "Everyone," she said. "That's what scared me." The defense argued panic, mob mentality, unintended escalation. The prosecution argued negligence, facilitation, moral responsibility. Both were right. Neither could fully prove it. Outside the courthouse, the story mutated again. Some papers called the sisters folk heroes. Others called them monsters in dresses. Feminist groups wrote letters of support. Church coalitions wrote letters demanding punishment. The state received threats from both sides. The mountains watched from a distance, unchanged. In December, the verdict came. 2 of the men were convicted. 1 walked free due to insufficient evidence. No charges were filed against the Moore sisters. The judge's statement was careful, almost reluctant. He acknowledged a community failure without naming it. He urged healing without suggesting how. It satisfied no one. Back in Harlan County, winter closed in early. Snow buried the old mining road where Keller died. The prayer circle did not resume. It could not. The land itself felt claimed by memory now, and memory does not make good shelter. The sisters withdrew. Ada stopped keeping records of anything beyond the garden. Ruth sang again, but only to herself. Late at night, windows closed. Lila took long walks alone and returned with less to say each time. They were not shunned, they were preserved. People spoke of them carefully, as if saying the wrong thing might wake something that had only just gone to sleep. Girls grew up hearing warnings framed as lessons. Boys grew up learning restraint not from fathers, but from absence. Years later, researchers would write about the case in journals, about gendered violence, about informal justice systems, about how authority collapses when institutions fail. They would miss the simpler truth. The Moore sisters did not create violence. They organized fear, and fear, once given structure, does not dissolve when the structure is removed. It looks for another place to live. By the time the snow melted in 1971, the circle was gone in name only. But its rules, spoken and unspoken, had spread beyond Cold Creek. Boundaries hardened, silence deepened. The mountains returned to their old work of holding stories without judging them. What remained unresolved was not who had gone too far. It was whether the hollow had ever been safe before the sisters gave it rules, and whether, without them, it ever would be again. By the spring of 1971, Harlan County looked ordinary again. That was the first lie. Grass returned to the slopes above Cold Creek. Bees moved between clover and dandelion as if nothing had happened. The road repairs finished, and trucks passed through without slowing. If you arrived then, you would have found no markers, no signs, no memorials. The place did not advertise what it had learned. Inside the hollow, people adjusted their behavior with a precision that never made the papers. Men spoke less. They stood farther apart. They asked permission with their eyes before their mouths ever opened. Women walked the creek paths alone again, not because danger had vanished, but because rules had been absorbed. Boundaries no longer needed a fire to be understood. The Moore sisters remained. They did not leave. They did not explain. They did not rebuild the circle in any form that could be named. Their house above Cold Creek stayed quiet, steady, unchanged. Ada kept bees and sold honey like before. Ruth played hymns that never traveled past the trees. Lila fixed fences, repaired tools, and spoke only when there was something worth finishing. People still watched them, not with fear, with calibration. Every community measures itself against something. In Harlan County, that measure had become 3 women who had refused to look away when something crossed a line, and had then watched as others took that refusal too far. In June, the state officially closed the case. James Keller's death was ruled the result of collective action resulting in fatal injury. No new charges, no appeals. The paperwork was filed. The mountain was cleared from the docket. The law moved on, satisfied it had reached the edge of its jurisdiction and stopped where the trees began. What the law never recorded were the smaller changes. Bars closed earlier. Churches stopped seating women behind men without explanation. High school boys learned restraint the hard way, not through lectures but through stories that ended without punchlines. The phrase "a kiss" regained its ordinary meaning in public, while privately it still carried weight. The Moore sisters were never charged, but they were never absolved either. That space between blame and praise became their permanent address. In the late 70s, a graduate student from Louisville came asking questions. She wanted to interview Ada about the ledger, Ruth about the hymns, Lila about enforcement. She was polite, careful, prepared. Ada declined. Ruth smiled and said she no longer sang for groups. Lila walked the student halfway down the road and said only this: "If you want to understand what happened here, stop looking for leaders." The student left with notes and no conclusion. Years passed. The men who had been punished lived long enough to watch their reputations outlast their injuries. Some moved away. Some stayed and learned quiet. None spoke publicly again. Their silence did more work than any warning ever had. In 1989, a regional paper ran a retrospective titled "The Appalachian Cult That Time Forgot." It got dates wrong. It exaggerated numbers. It described the sisters as fanatics, then victims, then enigmas. It sold well for a week and disappeared. The Hollow did not respond, because the Hollow never corrected stories. It kept them. By the time the Moore sisters aged into invisibility, the rules they had once held in place no longer belonged to them. They belonged to the culture. They had been passed down without attribution, enforced without ceremony, obeyed without fear of reprisal, only consequence. That was the final transformation. What began as reaction became habit. What began as protection became expectation. What began with a stolen kiss ended with an entire place learning how quickly order could be created, and how dangerous it was once others learned how to imitate it. Ada Moore died first, quietly, in her sleep. Ruth followed years later, hymns left unfinished on the piano. Lila lived the longest. She outlived the last man who had been punished, the last investigator who had asked questions, the last reporter who still remembered where Cold Creek ran. When she died, there was no crowd, just the mountains, just the land, just the rules, now invisible. No one ever rebuilt the circle. No one needed to, because the Hollow had absorbed what it was taught: that boundaries could be enforced without institutions, that silence could organize people faster than speeches, that fear did not need a leader, only permission, and that once a line is crossed in the name of order, it does not return to where it was before. Outsiders still argue about what the Moore sisters were: victims, villains, guardians, accidents of neglect. Inside Harlan County, the answer settled long ago. They were a moment, and moments, once past, leave behind something quieter and more permanent than justice. They leave a rule.